The spring of 1940 was a season of catastrophe. German panzers rolled across Western Europe with terrifying speed, crushing armies that had taken decades to build in mere weeks. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before Congress with an audacious proclamation that would change the course of history. He called for the production of 50,000 military aircraft in a single year, a number so staggering that it exceeded the total number of planes built in the United States since the Wright brothers first took flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903. When news of Roosevelt's declaration reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler's advisors dismissed it as nothing more than American propaganda. They had good reason to be skeptical. In 1939, the entire United States military aircraft production totaled fewer than 3,000 planes. The United States Army ranked 39th in the world, smaller than Romania's. America had approximately 630,000 soldiers, while Germany and Japan each boasted more than 4 million. The very idea that this sleeping giant could suddenly awaken and produce war material on an unprecedented scale seemed like fantasy. Hitler himself scoffed at the notion. In 1940, he confidently predicted that American intervention through mass deliveries of planes and war materials would not change the outcome of the war. The German military establishment agreed. Based on their own experience mobilizing for war, they calculated it would take the United States at least 4 years to fully mobilize its industrial capacity. By then, they believed, the war would already be won. They were catastrophically wrong. What Hitler and his generals failed to understand was something that would soon become terrifyingly clear. America possessed the most powerful industrial base the world had ever seen. It was a sleeping giant, yes, but one that once awakened would prove utterly unstoppable. The transformation that was about to take place would be so complete, so overwhelming, that it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in World War II and reshape the global order for generations to come. This is the story of how America became what Roosevelt called the great arsenal of democracy, and how a nation that could barely produce 3,000 planes in 1939 would go on to manufacture 300,000 aircraft by war's end, flooding the skies with American power and ultimately drowning the Axis forces in what one observer called an avalanche of production, the like of which the enemy had never seen nor dreamed possible. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, we must first understand just how unprepared America was in those dark days of 1940. The United States was still reeling from the Great Depression. Unemployment hovered around 17%. Factories stood idle. The military was a shadow of what it would become. The Army Air Corps possessed only about 1,700 aircraft in total, many of them obsolete. There were fewer than 200,000 men in the Army, only 125,000 in the Navy, and fewer than 20,000 Marines. The American aircraft industry was tiny, fragmented, and utterly inexperienced in mass production. In 1939, total aircraft production for civilian and military purposes combined was just over 6,000 planes. The industry ranked a distant 41st among American industries. Compare this to Germany, which had been building its Luftwaffe for years and had already demonstrated devastating aerial superiority in Poland and France. But Roosevelt saw what others couldn't, or wouldn't. He understood that while America's military might be small, its industrial potential was virtually limitless. On May 16, 1940, just days after Germany launched its blitzkrieg into Holland, Belgium and France, the President delivered his famous message to Congress. His words were urgent and uncompromising. "These are ominous days," Roosevelt declared, "days whose swift and shocking developments force every neutral nation to look to its defences in the light of new factors. The brutal force of modern offensive war has been loosed in all its horror." He painted a stark picture of the new reality of warfare. Motorized armies could now sweep through enemy territories at 200 miles a day. Parachute troops dropped behind enemy lines. Lightning attacks capable of destroying factories hundreds of miles behind the front were now standard tactics. And most importantly, Roosevelt noted that one belligerent power, Nazi Germany, not only had many more planes than all its opponents combined, but also appeared to have a weekly production capacity far greater than that of all its enemies. "From the point of view of our own defense," Roosevelt told Congress, "great additional production capacity is our principal air requisite. I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." The request was met with skepticism bordering on ridicule. Critics called it a wild fantasy. Aviation experts declared it impossible. But Roosevelt wasn't speaking literally about exact numbers. He was issuing a call to action, alerting Americans that a huge new level of effort would be required of the nation. He was setting a psychological goalpost, creating a vision of what American industry could become if properly mobilized. Within weeks, Congress responded, authorizing an appropriation of $896 million for national defense. But money alone wouldn't build planes. What Roosevelt needed was someone who could actually make it happen, someone who understood both mass production and how to mobilize an entire nation's industrial capacity. In May 1940, Roosevelt turned to his friend and advisor Bernard Baruch, who had managed American mobilization during World War I, and asked him to recommend the top production men in the country. Baruch's answer was immediate and emphatic. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. William Senius Knudsen was not an obvious choice. He was a Danish immigrant who had arrived in America in 1900 with just $30 in his pocket. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, he had worked his way up from menial jobs at a Bronx shipyard, enduring beatings from co-workers who called him squarehead, a slur for Scandinavian foreigners. He learned to box, the beatings stopped, and he immersed himself completely in the American dream. Knudsen was an engineer before the discipline formally existed. He had worked for Henry Ford, helping to revolutionize automotive production before moving to General Motors, where he eventually became president. Under his leadership, GM had become the largest industrial corporation in the world. He was earning $300,000 a year, an astronomical sum in 1940, and was at the peak of his power and influence. He was also a staunch Republican who had vocally opposed Roosevelt for 8 years. Roosevelt had famously railed against economic royalists, and if anyone embodied that description, it was William Knudsen, the president of General Motors. When Roosevelt picked up the phone to call him, it was an unlikely partnership to say the least. But what both men understood, what they put above partisan politics, was that the stakes couldn't possibly be higher. Western civilization itself hung in the balance. When Roosevelt asked Knudsen to come to Washington to work on some production matters, there was no hesitation. Knudsen immediately resigned from General Motors, walked away from his $300,000 salary, and agreed to serve his adopted country for the token sum of $1 per year. Alfred Sloan, Knudsen's predecessor at GM and still a powerful voice in the company, thought he was making a terrible mistake. "They'll make a monkey out of you down there in Washington," Sloan warned. But Knudsen felt indebted to America, the country that had given him everything. This was his moment to pay that debt. He became the first of what would eventually be about 300 industrial executives known as the $1-a-year men, corporate leaders who gave up lucrative positions to serve the government for nominal pay, dedicating themselves to building what would become known as the arsenal of democracy. Knudsen's first challenge was formidable. The United States had no real plan for industrial mobilization. The Joint Army-Navy plan consisted of a mere 20 pages, an entirely inadequate amateurish effort. Neither the military nor the government had any clear idea how to actually mobilize American industry for war. And in the middle of a fierce national debate about isolationism, the government didn't even have the clear authority to begin the process. But Knudsen understood something fundamental that others didn't. The solution wasn't to have the government take over industry. It was to harness the power of the free market, to create incentives that would make companies eager to convert to war production, to remove the obstacles that were holding them back. He identified 3 critical problems. First, companies were reluctant to invest in expanding their facilities for war production because they feared being left with excess capacity when the war ended, if it ended. The Depression had conditioned capitalists to expect static economic conditions, and they saw wartime expansion as a risky short-term investment. Second, the government's contracting process was slow, cumbersome, and risky for manufacturers. Companies were expected to begin retooling and expansion before formal contracts were even signed, with no guarantee they would be reimbursed. Third, the normal timeline for writing off new plants and equipment, 16 years, made wartime investment financially unattractive. Knudsen attacked each problem systematically. He convinced Roosevelt to allow letters of intent, official War or Navy Department letters stating the government's intention to do business with a firm, to serve as bankable commitments that companies could take to their banks to secure financing. Roosevelt was skeptical. Never in the history of the United States had such a provision been made. But Knudsen insisted that the time for slow, deliberate action was over. Without this change, Roosevelt's 50,000 planes a year would remain nothing but a pipe dream. The administration also implemented cost-plus contracting, which limited but guaranteed manufacturer profits and allowed 30% advance payments to manufacturers. The amortization period for new plants and equipment was reduced from 16 years to just 5 years, allowing manufacturers to write off their investments in a reasonable time frame. These changes were revolutionary. By October 1940, just 5 months after Knudsen arrived in Washington, he'd overseen the awarding of 920 military contracts, valued at more than $9 billion. Approximately 500 companies had agreed to make everything from ships to tanks to gunpowder to ammonia. Development of 784 new factories was underway. The transformation had begun. But would it be fast enough? Converting industrial capacity to war production was one thing when it came to tanks or guns or ships. Aircraft was something else entirely. An automobile of the era had about 15,000 parts and weighed around 3,000 pounds. A B-24 Liberator heavy bomber had 450,000 parts and 360,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. It weighed 18 tons fully loaded and stretched 67 feet in length. Aviation experts scoffed at the idea that car makers could build such complex machines. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," sneered Dutch Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation. The prevailing wisdom was that aircraft required artisan-level craftsmanship, careful hand assembly, and constant design changes that were incompatible with mass production techniques. But there was one man who thought differently. His name was Charles Sorensen, vice president of production at Ford Motor Company, and he was about to prove that the impossible could be done. In January 1941, the federal government established the Liberator Production Pool program to meet projected demand for the B-24 Liberator, America's heavy bomber. Initially, Ford Motor Company was assigned to build components, with final assembly to be performed by the plane's designer, Consolidated Aircraft, at their facility in San Diego. Sorensen traveled to San Diego to observe Consolidated's operations. What he saw horrified him. Inside the Consolidated plant, workers were putting together wing sections and fuselage portions by hand. The final assembly was conducted outdoors under the bright California sun on a structural steel fixture. The heat and temperature changes so distorted this fixture that it was impossible to turn out two planes alike without further adjustment. Consolidated and Air Force officials talked about Ford producing center and outer wing sections. But Sorensen realized that if wing sections had uniform measurements, the way Ford made parts for automobiles, they wouldn't fit properly under the outdoor assembly conditions at Consolidated. It was discouraging. When the Consolidated people pressed him, asking how he would do it, Sorensen replied, "I'll have something for you tomorrow morning." That night in his hotel room at the Hotel del Coronado, Sorensen worked feverishly. He knew that comparing a Ford V8 engine to a 4-engine Liberator bomber was like matching a garage with a skyscraper. But despite their enormous differences, he believed the same fundamental principles of mass production could apply. He spread papers across his room, arranging them to represent the various components and sub-assemblies of the bomber. He studied the flow, considering how parts would move through a factory, how they would come together at the main assembly line. He worked through the night, shifting his makeshift pieces, calculating, reconsidering, refining. By 4 a.m, he was satisfied. His piles of paper were arranged in proper order and represented what he believed was the most logical progression of units to the main assembly line. And he knew something else, something that would prove prophetic. He was certain the Germans had neither the facilities nor the conception for greater bomber mass production. On his hotel notepaper, Sorensen roughed out a pencil sketch of a factory floor plan. It would be 1 mile long and 1/4 mile wide, the biggest single industrial building ever constructed. That sketch, which he still carried years later with Edsel Ford's initials on it, became the blueprint for Willow Run. The Ford company returned to the government with a counter-proposal. They wouldn't just build parts for the B-24, they would build complete airplanes using the automaker's highly refined mass production techniques. Construction of the Willow Run plant began in 1941 on farmland Henry Ford owned near Willow Run Creek, about 30 miles west of Detroit. Working with legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn, Ford officials planned a facility that would dwarf anything ever built before. The main building would have 3.5 million square feet of factory space. Some sources say as much as 4.7 million square feet, making it the largest factory under a single roof anywhere in the world. The final design was L-shaped rather than the straight line Sorensen originally envisioned, due to property easement issues. But the assembly line itself would still stretch over a mile long, with dual parallel assembly lines running through the plant. One of the most innovative features was a series of 4 large turntables positioned about 2/3 of the way along the assembly lines. These allowed the massive B-24 production lines to make 90-degree turns before continuing to final assembly, an engineering marvel that enabled the mile-long line to fit on the available property. The scale of the construction project was staggering. The government contributed $200 million to the project. An entire airfield with 6 runways was built adjacent to the plant so that completed bombers could be tested immediately. In 1942, the federal government built the nation's second freeway, now Interstate 94, to move workers and materials to the Willow Run plant. Finding workers was an enormous challenge. The plant was too far from Detroit for easy commuting, and housing in the area was virtually non-existent. To solve this problem, the federal government spent $20 million to construct an entire community adjacent to the plant. In a matter of days, dormitories for single workers and small houses to accommodate families appeared. Willow Run Village eventually grew to include more than 15,000 residents in 30 dormitories, 6 community buildings, rows of small houses, commercial buildings, police and fire stations, and schools. The Willow Run Lodge dormitories accommodated 3,000 single women and men. Inside the plant, the infrastructure was equally impressive. 24 lunchrooms were scattered throughout the complex, with lunch wagons travelling the factory floor to serve workers who couldn't leave their stations. The plant's kitchen prepared nearly 10,000 rolls each day. An on-site hospital with 8 doctors, 40 nurses, and a dentist handled medical needs. Over the course of the war, the hospital would treat more than 2 million medical cases, remarkably without recording a single workplace fatality. The Aircraft Apprentice School trained up to 8,000 students per week, teaching them the specialised skills needed to build bombers. Newly hired workers attended orientation lectures about the aircraft industry, the B-24's importance to the war effort, and the dire consequences should the Allies lose. Specialised employees, riveters, electricians, mechanics, received intensive training in on-site classrooms. But building the factory was only the beginning. Actually making it work proved far more difficult than anyone anticipated. Although the Ford Trimitar had been a success in the 1920s, Ford had largely avoided aviation since then. The company was trying to apply automobile assembly techniques to a machine of unprecedented complexity, and the learning curve was steep. Despite intensive design efforts, the opening of the plant saw significant mismanagement and bungling. Quality was uneven. A 1943 congressional committee issued a highly critical report, noting that Ford had created a production line that too closely resembled an automobile assembly line, despite the warnings of many experienced aircraftmen. There were other problems. Consolidated Aircraft was still in charge of design, but they had no blueprints for Ford to work from, just sketches, drawings, and templates. The Air Force kept demanding modifications and upgrades. More performance and safety changes were dictated for B-24s than for any other American warplane. These changeovers required onerous delays and costly retooling. Sorensen protested that Willow Run could not function under these conditions. Mass production required continuous assembly flow. Otherwise, bombers simply couldn't be built at the rate needed. A compromise was reached. Willow Run stepped up outsourcing of parts production and sub-assemblies to almost 1,000 Ford factories and independent suppliers, while focusing on building B-24s in more predictable designs. Completed planes would fly off to field modification centres for fixes, upgrades and customizing. In October 1942, the first plane rolled off the line, christened the Spirit of Ypsilanti. But production remained painfully slow. Ford built just one plane that month. Critics began to wonder if the skeptics had been right all along. Had Ford bitten off more than it could chew? Was this proof that you couldn't mass-produce complex aircraft the way you built cars? While Ford struggled with the B-24 at Willow Run, Another aircraft production program was underway that would dwarf even that massive undertaking in ambition, complexity and cost. This was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most technologically advanced bomber of World War II and the most expensive weapons program ever undertaken to that point. The B-29 Superfortress cost $3 billion to design and produce, far exceeding the $1.9 billion cost of the Manhattan Project. To put this in perspective, the B-29 program cost more than the atomic bombs it was designed to carry. It was the largest aircraft manufacturing project undertaken in the United States during World War II, and it would push American industrial capacity to its absolute limits. The B-29 was massive, spanning 141 feet, 3 inches from wingtip to wingtip, and measuring 99 feet from nose to tail. Its 27-foot 9-inch high tail turret stood as tall as a 3-story house. But size wasn't what made the B-29 revolutionary. It featured the first ever pressurized bomber cabin, dual-wheeled tricycle landing gear, and an analog computer-controlled fire control system that allowed one gunner and a fire control officer to direct 4 remote machine gun turrets. One B-29 required 12 tons of aluminum sheeting, over 450 kilograms of copper, 600,000 rivets, approximately 14 kilometers of wiring, and 3 kilometers of tubing for its construction. The aircraft had 40,540 different parts. Compare this to the B-24's already staggering 450,000 parts, and you begin to understand the magnitude of the challenge. The complexity of the B-29 meant that traditional assembly line methods wouldn't work. Boeing engineers realized that the single-line approach used at Willow Run couldn't handle an aircraft this intricate. Production engineer Oliver West developed a solution called multi-lining, which replaced the traditional single assembly line with 6 lines that converged around 3 final assembly lines at the entrance of the plant. Even with this innovation, production of the B-29 was plagued with problems from the start. By the end of 1943, although almost 100 aircraft had been delivered, only 15 were airworthy. The most common source of failures was the engines. The Wright R350 duplex Cyclone radial engines were powerful, but notoriously unreliable in their early iterations, prone to overheating and catastrophic failures. This crisis prompted what became known as the Battle of Kansas. During March and April 1944, production personnel were sent from the factories to modification centres to speed the availability of sufficient aircraft to equip the first bomb groups. This resulted in 150 aircraft being modified in 5 weeks, between March 10 and April 15, 1944. The scale of B-29 production required multiple facilities. The planes were built at 4 principal plants: Renton, Wichita, Marietta, and Omaha, with Boeing, Bell, and Martin as the main companies involved, along with thousands of others providing components and partial assembly. Boeing's Wichita plant produced 1,644 B-29s, accounting for 44% of the entire B-29 production, plus an additional 125 Superfortresses in spare parts. At the Glen L. Martin plant in Omaha, the facility was so large it had its own telephone system, bank, post office, hotel, library, police, fire and sanitation systems. By 1945, over 13,000 employees were building B-29s there. The Bell plant in Marietta, Georgia, faced significant challenges. Despite occupying more than twice the area of the Renton or Wichita plants, it experienced problems from the start, including an inadequate workforce and difficulties with material shortages. By the end of 1944, 7,200 workers were employed there, working 2 9-hour shifts 7 days a week, and the labour force peaked at 27,000 in the spring of 1945. Once production hit its stride, the numbers became staggering. Production of the B-29 rapidly increased throughout 1944, with the 500th aircraft being accepted in July and the 1,000th in November. By March 1945, the 2,000th B-29 was accepted, and by June, the 3,000th. The peak production rate was reached in April 1945 with 300 aircraft per month, which further increased to 375 aircraft in the last full month of production. At the end of the war, Boeing Wichita was producing 4.2 Superfortresses per working day for an average of 100 per month. The plant had reduced the number of man-hours to produce a single B-29 from 157,000, the average required for the first 100 bombers, to less than 20,000. This represented a nearly 8-fold improvement in productivity, accomplished by a workforce that had never built an airplane before the war began. In total, 3,170 B-29s were built by Boeing in Wichita, Kansas and Renton, Washington, Bell Aircraft in Georgia, and the Glenn L. Martin Company in Nebraska, with production ending in 1946. The B-29 would prove decisive in ending the war with Japan. First used in an attack on Bangkok in June 1944, the superfortresses shortly afterwards became part of a concentrated bombing campaign on the Japanese mainland. From bases as far as 2,000 nautical miles away, these bombers could strike at the heart of the Japanese Empire with a payload and range no other bomber could match. And of course, it was two specially modified B-29s, the Enola Gay and Bockscar, that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, bringing World War II to its final conclusion and ushering in the atomic age. The B-29 program demonstrated that American industry could not only produce aircraft in unprecedented quantities, but could also successfully manufacture the most technologically sophisticated weapons systems ever created. It was a triumph of engineering, organization, and sheer determination, and it came with a price tag that exceeded every other weapons program in history up to that point. But slowly, painfully, Willow Run found its rhythm. The workers learned. The processes improved. The bugs were worked out. Production began to climb, first gradually, then exponentially. By June 1943, 1 year after the plant was fully operational, Willow Run was producing bombers at a rate that began to justify the investment. By the end of 1943, the plant had hit its stride, and in 1944 the numbers became truly staggering. At its peak, Willow Run produced one complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Think about that for a moment. A machine with 450,000 parts, 360,000 rivets, 4 massive engines weighing 18 tons, rolling off the line every single hour. The plant operated 2 9-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The remaining 4 hours each day were used to restock parts and change tooling. By June 1944, Willow Run was producing nearly 500 bombers per month, with the capability to produce 650 per month. The Army, incredibly, had to slow production to 200 per month because they had nowhere to park the planes. Losses in combat hadn't been as high as expected, and American bombers were filling airfields faster than they could be deployed. When the last B-24 rolled off the Willow Run assembly line on June 28, 1945, the plant had produced 8,685 complete Liberators, nearly half of all B-24s built during the war. Together with Consolidated, Douglas Aircraft and North American Aviation, American manufacturers produced more than 18,000 of these massive bombers, more than any other American warplane in history. And Willow Run was just one factory, just one piece of the arsenal of democracy. While Ford was revolutionizing bomber production at Willow Run, an industrial transformation of epic proportions was taking place across America. Every major automaker converted to war production. General Motors' Buick division received a contract to build 500 aircraft engines per month. That number was soon doubled, then doubled again, until by 1944 Buick's Melrose Park facility was turning out 2,000 engines monthly. At GM's Allison engine plant in Indianapolis, the V1710 engine was being produced for both the Lockheed P-38 Lightning and the North American P-51 Mustang fighters. The Cadillac division built the turbocharged V-12 aircraft engine, regarded by many as the most advanced aircraft engine of World War II. The Chevrolet division produced wing sections and fuselage components for the Grumman TBM Avenger, as well as complete TBMs at its Trenton, New Jersey plant. Chrysler didn't just make tanks. The company that had built automobiles was now producing aircraft engines, anti-aircraft guns, and specialized military vehicles. At the Detroit Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, a facility built specifically for tank production, Chrysler would eventually manufacture 22,234 tanks, more than Nazi Germany produced during the entire war. Even companies with no aircraft experience joined the effort. Goodyear, the tire company, built airships for submarine patrol and manufactured F-4U Corsair planes when Chance Vought couldn't keep up with demand. In 1939, Goodyear Aircraft had just 30 workers. By 1942, it employed 35,000. Boeing, based in Seattle, built 16,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses at plants in Seattle, Renton, and Wichita. But B-17s were also built by Douglas Aircraft and Lockheed, competitors who set aside rivalry to focus on the mission at hand. This kind of cooperation was unprecedented. Auto industry rivals teamed up to make parts for bombers. Briggs, GM's Fisher Body, and the Murray Corporation agreed to make components for Boeing's B-17. The scale of production was almost incomprehensible. In 1939, the United States produced just over 2,000 total aircraft. In 1940, production doubled to approximately 6,000. In 1941, it doubled again. And in 1942, the first full year after Pearl Harbor, American factories produced 47,000 aircraft. But that was just the beginning. Production continued to climb. In 1943, American factories built 86,000 aircraft. In 1944, that single year, the United States built 96,000 planes. That's more aircraft in 12 months than Japan produced during the entire war, from 1939 to 1945. Let that sink in. In 1944 alone, America built more planes than Japan built in 6 years of total war. By the time the war ended in 1945, the United States had produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft of all types. This included everything from massive B-29 superfortresses to nimble P-51 Mustang fighters, from sturdy C-47 transport planes to deadly dive bombers. American factories had gone from producing fewer than 3,000 planes in 1939 to an average of over 60,000 per year during the war years. The transformation wasn't limited to aircraft. American industry provided almost two-thirds of all Allied military equipment produced during the war: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. In 4 years, American industrial production, already the world's largest before the war, doubled in size. But these astronomical numbers tell only part of the story. Behind every statistic was a human drama of transformation, sacrifice, and determination. When the war began, many of the young men who would traditionally have filled factory jobs were joining the military instead. Companies had to look elsewhere for workers. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They became riveters, welders, mechanics, and assemblers. At Willow Run alone, tens of thousands of women worked on the assembly lines. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, a strong woman rolling up her sleeves to show she could do the job, was inspired by real women like Roosevelt Monroe, who moved from Kentucky to work at Willow Run. African Americans, who had been largely excluded from defense industry jobs due to segregation and discrimination, fought for and won the right to participate in the production miracle. A. Philip Randolph, founder and leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, threatened to organize a massive march on Washington to protest inequality in the military and defense industries. Just days before the march, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in federally contracted defense industries. Workers came from all over the country, drawn by good wages and the sense that they were part of something larger than themselves. By the summer of 1943, 350,000 workers from other parts of the country had relocated to Detroit alone. Similar migrations happened in Seattle, Los Angeles, Mobile, and other production centers. You felt that you had to get this done as soon as you can and as fast as you can, remembered Geraldine Green, who worked in defense production. You wanted to get it over with as soon as possible, and we did whatever was necessary. It was a round-the-clock effort. Factories operated 7 days a week. At some facilities, workers slept on cots between shifts, waiting for the next plane to roll off the line. The work was demanding, often dangerous, and always urgent. Everyone understood what was at stake. While bombers like the B-17 and B-24 captured public imagination with their size and destructive power, it was another aircraft that would prove absolutely critical to Allied victory, the North American P-51 Mustang. And the story of how that plane came to be is itself a testament to American ingenuity and the power of international cooperation. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, asking them to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. The company's president, Dutch Kindleberger, the same man who had scoffed at the idea of mass-producing aircraft, responded with a bold counterproposal. Instead of building someone else's design, North American would design and build a superior fighter from the ground up. It was an audacious claim. North American aviation had never built a fighter aircraft before, but Kindleberger's chief designer, Edgar Schmied, had been sketching designs for months, and he believed they could create something revolutionary using the Allison engine. The British agreed, and just 102 days after the contract was signed, the prototype NA-73X rolled out of the hangar. On October 26, 1940, the aircraft took its first flight. The British christened it the Mustang. The original Mustang was impressive at low altitudes, but its Allison engine struggled above 15,000 feet, limiting its effectiveness in high-altitude combat over Europe. The breakthrough came when a British test pilot, Ronald Harker, evaluated the Mustang and concluded that what it needed was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The British fitted 5 test aircraft with Merlin engines, and the results were astounding. The Merlin-powered Mustangs reached speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, almost 100 miles per hour faster than the Allison version. North American quickly adopted the Merlin engine, which was manufactured under license in the United States by Packard. The result was a fighter that combined exceptional speed, range, and maneuverability. With improved range and speed, P-51 squadrons could now accompany 8th Air Force bombers on long-range raids deep into Germany. For the first time, American heavy bombers had fighter protection for their entire mission. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Before the Mustang arrived in significant numbers, American bomber losses over Germany were catastrophic. On August 17, 1943, 60 out of 356 American bombers were lost in a single day, almost all beyond the range of existing fighter escorts. But by early 1944, with the Mustang's arrival and new aggressive tactics, the tide of the air war was beginning to turn in the Allies' favour. During Big Week in February 1944, a week-long bombing offensive targeting German aircraft production, Mustang pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. At peak production times, North American aviation produced 857 P-51s in a single month. North American built more than 14,000 Mustangs during the war, with over 8,300 being the D-model variant featuring the distinctive bubble canopy and 6 50-caliber machine guns. Production was so efficient that there were rows of completed P-51Ds at the North American factory in Inglewood, California, just waiting for delivery pilots. The Mustang's influence extended beyond its combat record. Hermann Göring, commander of the German Luftwaffe, reportedly said, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." It was an admission that the war was lost, not because of any single battle or campaign, but because American industry had produced a weapon that the Germans simply couldn't match in quality or quantity. But aircraft were only part of America's production miracle. While Ford was revolutionizing bomber production at Willow Run, another industrialist was applying similar mass production principles to an equally critical need: cargo ships to transport men and material across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Henry J. Kaiser was a dam builder who had never constructed a ship in his life until 1940. He had made his name building the Hoover Dam, Bonneville Dam, and the Grand Coulee Dam, massive construction projects that required organizational genius and innovative production methods. In December 1940, Kaiser and 2 partners won a government contract to build 30 cargo ships for the British, and he established his first Richmond shipyard. What Kaiser understood was the same principle that Charles Sorensen grasped about bomber production. Ships didn't have to be built the traditional way. For centuries, ships had been constructed from the keel up by a single crew of workers, a process that could take 6 months or more. Kaiser adapted mass production techniques to shipbuilding, instituting modular construction in which ship sections were welded together instead of riveted. Components were prefabricated in different locations and brought together for final assembly. The centerpiece of Kaiser's production was the Liberty ship, a standardized cargo vessel measuring 441 feet long and 56 feet wide, capable of carrying 9,000 tons of cargo. These weren't beautiful ships. They were utilitarian, mass-produced vessels designed for one purpose: getting supplies across the ocean as quickly as possible. Kaiser's ships were completed in 2/3 the time and 1/4 the cost of the average of all other shipyards. Liberty ships were typically assembled in a little over 2 weeks, but even that wasn't fast enough for Kaiser. In November 1942, the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Peary was assembled in less than 5 days, specifically 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. It was a record that still stands, a demonstration of what American industrial might could accomplish when properly mobilized. Kaiser's 7 shipyards built 1,490 ships during the war, 27% of all ships ordered by the U.S. Maritime Commission. Between 1941 and 1945, 18 American shipyards built 2,851 Liberty ships, easily the largest class of ships ever built. Kaiser's yards also produced Casablanca-class escort carriers, small aircraft carriers that proved invaluable in anti-submarine warfare and providing air support for amphibious landings. Like Knudsen at the national level and Ford at Willow Run, Kaiser understood that production wasn't just about facilities and equipment, it was about people. Kaiser actively recruited workers from all over the United States, swelling Richmond's population from 20,000 to over 100,000 in 3 short years. He hired women and minorities for jobs previously denied to them. He paid higher wages than comparable industries, and assumed that anyone who came to work would need to be trained from scratch. And like Ford, Kaiser understood that workers needed support to be productive. He established healthcare facilities for his workers and their families, facilities that would eventually become Kaiser Permanente, one of America's largest health maintenance organizations, still serving millions of people today. The avalanche of American production had a decisive impact on every theater of the war. In the Pacific, American aircraft carriers, 17 built during the war compared to Japan's 6, provided overwhelming air superiority. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber sank 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, including 4 at the Battle of Midway, the turning point of the Pacific War. In Europe, American bombers filled the skies. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator conducted devastating strategic bombing campaigns against German industry and infrastructure. And the P-51 Mustang provided the fighter escort that made those bombing missions possible, protecting the bombers deep into German territory and engaging the Luftwaffe in combat that steadily wore down Germany's fighter forces. But American production didn't just equip American forces. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States provided massive quantities of equipment to its allies. The British received thousands of aircraft from American production. The Soviet Union received 14,000 aircraft, along with thousands of trucks, raw materials, aviation fuel, and engines. At the Tehran conference, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin raised a toast to American production, without which the war would have been lost. William Knudsen's prophetic statement was proving true. We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible. Remember Hitler's confident prediction in 1940 that American intervention through mass deliveries of planes and war materials would not change the outcome of the war? That assessment, shared by his military advisors, was based on German experience and conventional wisdom about industrial mobilization. They believed it would take America 4 years to fully mobilize. What they failed to understand was that American industry operated on fundamentally different principles than German industry. Germany's military production was tied to resources outside its control, dependent on conquered territories and forced labor. The German system was highly centralized, bureaucratic, and inflexible. American production, by contrast, was decentralized, competitive, and incredibly adaptive. Companies competed for contracts but also cooperated when necessary. The profit motive drove innovation and efficiency. The free market system, properly harnessed and directed, proved far more effective than centralized planning. Moreover, America had something Germany lacked: protection from aerial bombardment and ground invasion. American factories could operate at full capacity without fear of destruction. Workers didn't have to worry about bombs falling on their homes. Supply lines from raw materials to factories to training bases remained secure and efficient. The Germans also underestimated American ingenuity. When told that aircraft were too complex for mass production, American engineers didn't accept that limitation. They overcame it. They broke down complex assemblies into manageable components. They standardized parts. They applied the principles of the assembly line to machines of unprecedented complexity. They proved that the impossible was merely difficult. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, it was too late. Time magazine noted in February 1942 The miracle of American productivity was something Hitler didn't understand. But Hitler did understand it. He was deathly afraid of it. He simply didn't believe America could mobilize fast enough. Thanks to Roosevelt's foresight in beginning mobilization in 1940, before America even entered the war, the United States had an 18-month head start that proved decisive. When World War II ended in August 1945, the arsenal of democracy had produced not just 300,000 aircraft, but a complete transformation of American industry, society, and global standing. The United States emerged from the war as the world's preeminent economic and military power, a position it has maintained ever since. The industrial techniques developed during the war, mass production of complex systems, supply chain management, quality control, and rapid innovation, became the foundation of post-war American prosperity. The management principles pioneered by Knudsen and other dollar-a-year men influenced business practices for generations. The social changes were equally profound. Women and African Americans who had entered the industrial workforce during the war had demonstrated their capabilities in ways that couldn't be ignored. While the immediate post-war period saw some regression, the seeds of social change had been planted. The Willow Run plant itself had various afterlives. Kaiser Frazer used it to build automobiles from 1947 to 1953. General Motors bought it in 1956 and produced transmissions there until 2010. Today, the site houses the American Center for Mobility, a proving ground and research facility for autonomous vehicles, a fitting evolution for a place that once represented the cutting edge of American innovation. Of the approximately 18,500 B-24 Liberators built during the war, only 13 survive today, 4 of them from Willow Run. These rare survivors stand as physical reminders of the production miracle that helped save the free world. William Knudsen, the Danish immigrant who became the architect of the Arsenal of Democracy, received the Distinguished Service Medal and was commissioned as a lieutenant general, the only civilian in American history to receive such a rank without prior military service. When he resigned his commission on May 1, 1945, General H.H. Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, wrote to him, "I look back with great appreciation upon the way you handled the creation of new factories, the tooling required, and the changes necessary in the production lines." Knudsen died in 1948, but his legacy lives on in the simple truth he proved, that free people, working together toward a common goal, can accomplish things that seem impossible, that American industry, properly mobilized, is an irresistible force, that democracy, when threatened, can summon resources and capabilities that totalitarian systems can never match. The Germans laughed at American factories in 1940. They dismissed Roosevelt's call for 50,000 planes a year as propaganda and fantasy. Hitler's advisors confidently predicted that American production wouldn't matter, that the war would be won before America could mobilize. They were looking at the numbers: fewer than 3,000 planes in 1939, a tiny army, an unprepared nation, and they saw weakness. What they failed to see was potential. They failed to understand what happens when you wake a sleeping giant. By the war's end, America hadn't produced 50,000 planes in a year. It had far exceeded that target. In 1944 alone, American factories built 96,000 aircraft. Over the course of the war, 300,000 planes rolled off American assembly lines, one bomber every 63 minutes. From Willow Run alone, an avalanche of production that buried the Axis powers beneath its weight. The skeptics had said it couldn't be done. Dutch Kindleberger said you couldn't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight. German military planners said America couldn't mobilize fast enough. Even some Americans doubted whether the industrial miracle was possible. They were all wrong, not because the challenge wasn't real. It was enormous, not because there weren't setbacks and struggles. There were many. They were wrong because they underestimated what free people can accomplish when their cause is just and their determination is absolute. The Germans laughed at American factories. Then 100,000 planes appeared, and then another 100,000, and another. They filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific. They turned the tide of battle. They carried freedom on their wings. This is the story of how America became the arsenal of democracy. How a nation that ranked 39th in military power transformed itself into the most productive force the world had ever seen. How dollar-a-year men and Rosie the Riveters worked around the clock to build the weapons that would save civilization. how engineers accomplish the impossible by refusing to accept that word. It's a story about American exceptionalism, but not the kind based on boasting or bravado. It's exceptionalism earned through sweat and sacrifice, through innovation and determination, through the hard work of millions of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The Germans laughed at US factories, but the last laugh belonged to America, because when you wake a sleeping giant, you don't get a fair fight. You get an avalanche, and there's no surviving that.